Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 11 of our series, A Secular Bible Study, in which today we look at 1 Kings. What a book this is. So much happens here. There's a lot to go through. There's a lot of problematic passages, which I know has become kind of the favorite for most of you watching is point 7. But I'd encourage you to see what really happens here during the book overview and even the literary techniques that are used and all of the main themes, etc. But I get it. A lot of the very interesting things are the contradictions, the errors, the misconceptions, and again, those problematic verses. So let's talk about what this book is. This is a continuation of the historical narrative of the monarchy of Israel. The monarchy just got started with Saul and David, as we saw in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings was not meant to be divided. It's just for scroll length that the Greek version, the Septuagint, decided to split it into two separate books. We get some of the Bible's most prominent characters here as we start to look more deeply at Solomon and at Elijah. We also get a structure here, and I've mentioned this before in some other books, that looks so crafted that it almost has to be fake, or it almost has to be a metaphor, or just an alluding to something in general, as opposed to specific people with specific events. The problem that lies with this is that many parts of this book and the other books that I've mentioned need to be taken literally. We need to literally believe there was a King David who had a son Solomon and see this succession down to Jesus. We need to believe literally that these nations and people and states existed, or so much of the foundation for what is built to be literal truth in the New Testament is swept away. But there's a construction here that looks extremely man-made. And granted, many Christians read the Bible in this fashion, but I just wonder how they can dismiss the parts that need to be taken literally and sweep them up, and when we can start to say, this is metaphor, this is literal, this person didn't really exist, this is just a story about Israel as a whole, and this person definitely existed, we needed him to get to Jesus. It's the same thing that happens in the New Testament, by the way, and I'm already getting off on a tangent way too early in this episode. Let's narrow in. Let's begin with point 1, book overview. This book starts off exactly where the last ended. We have an aging, very old David, very sad, dejected. His life did not turn out the way that he thought. He gave in to sin and compromised his values just like everyone before him. He was supposed to be special and set apart, a man after God's own heart, and he was no different. In some ways, I would argue he was vastly worse. And we have him with his son Solomon, who is supposed to take the throne. I'm not going to cover all of the side stories. There are 100 side stories in 1 Kings that deserve attention. Like, for instance, when Nathan goes to Bathsheba because he's worried that Solomon won't be king, so they devise a plan to go and confront David. That story has so much wrong with it and so many interesting points with the role of the prophets and understanding the different marriages that David had. Like, we could dive into that for an hour, and I plan to. I don't know if it'll be after this series or in conjunction, but I want to get to Bible stories instead of just Bible study and start deconstructing these stories that deserve more attention from us. But back to what we're talking about, Solomon does need to take the throne from David, and we see this handoff. Solomon gets anointed, and at first we get a speech from David that is very reminiscent of every end speech we have seen so far in the Bible. You have Moses do it, you have Joshua do it, you have Samuel do it to a certain extent about the importance of following through with God's law, keeping the covenants, etc. And then immediately after that, we get just a who cares apparently. We're going to take it back into our own hands and let's devise a plan of which people need to be eliminated. Let's talk political assassinations and get some of these people off the map to ensure Solomon's reign. The inconsistencies with any of these kings, and this is a book of kings, we're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45 kings mentioned throughout the course of this book or these books, and they're all terrible. Well, 8 of them get graded okay, but they're all just awful. They're inconsistent, they're hypocritical. Some of the time they get praised for doing something that someone else will get absolutely annihilated for doing. So there's no consistency with God's favor or God's law or God's required punishment. We see it all over the place, just like we did with David and Saul. In 1 Samuel, we see Saul, when he messes up, getting his consequence. He loses the kingdom, he dies. In 2 Samuel, we see David mess up, and anyone but David gets the consequence. His son, his people, his 8 wives, etc. God plays favorites here, and it doesn't seem to matter because they all end up the same at the end of the day. So I'm going to have to pick up the pace because I've only covered like the first 2 chapters so far, and there's 22 chapters in 1 Kings alone. In chapter 3, we get Solomon asking for wisdom. Now, this, again, is something that needs to be looked at on its own and really deconstructed, but it's the favorite Bible story of so many people. It's the genie in the sky God granting Solomon one wish, and we're so proud of Solomon's choice. He chooses wisdom. Does he choose riches? Does he choose women? Nope, but he'll get all of that with his crafty lofty wisdom. Solomon had incredible political desires, and the absolute best way to ensure that he could fulfill those desires would be to be wiser and smarter than everyone else. A couple funny parts of this story is that God only grants it because he asked for the right thing instead of riches or a long life, and he goes on to promise him that no one has had this kind of wisdom before, and no one after will ever have this kind of wisdom. Keep that in mind, please, as we go through the rest of Solomon's choices here in this book. I think the author's overstretched here. We see his very first example on display immediately. He wakes up from that dream where he's talking with God, he gets his wisdom, and bam, 2 prostitutes come in and they've got the baby debacle that we all know about. He gives his amazing advice. He tells them that we'll just cut it in half, and thus we'll find out who the real mom is, because the real mom would want the child to live no matter what. Brilliant. Oh my gosh, who could have ever thought of this? Only Solomon. So anyways, hitting fast forward here, we see Solomon's building of his reign. First of all, he builds the actual temple, fulfilling David's wish to build a house for the Lord, and we get this long, super detailed account of what the temple should look like. Gold here, jewels here, picture here, image here. It's all so specific. We've seen this also with the ark, we've seen this with the tabernacle, and it always amazes me. It feels important for me to point out that you can take chapters and paragraphs and sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence to this kind of detail in the limited, finite scope of God was only going to give us this much, 800,000 words, and we spend how many of them on what the temple should look like and 0 on abolishing slavery. In this very book, Solomon, the wisest person who has ever existed in the history of time, reinstitutes slave labor. You're telling me God couldn't have taken 3 words? Do not enslave out of the 800,000, but we needed hundreds of words to describe the majesty of his temple? That's baffling to me. So supposedly things are going really good for Solomon during this time, but then he starts messing up. He marries hundreds of women, all for political alliance purposes. With all of that wisdom, he knew exactly who to marry, what alliances he needed, etc. In doing so, he becomes filthy rich. In fact, all of chapter 10 is about how wealthy he is. It also mixes in there the story of the Queen of Sheba that comes to visit him, but it's mainly about how much gold he got in just a singular year. Again, a whole chapter dedicated to accounting for the riches, as in the blessings of this individual who was the wisest person ever, with hundreds and hundreds of wives and an institution of slavery. Tell me again, these are not God's priorities. This is the last time we'll get as much detail about a king. It's kind of these 3 were the prominent figures, just showing that no one could hold God's covenant correctly, that power corrupted each and every single one of them. We move on into chapters like 12, 13, 14, where we see 2 individuals. You have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We see false idols here. We see all kinds of wrongdoings, and the kingdom of Jerusalem splits. So Jerusalem is where David had established that would be the kingdom of Israel's political and spiritual capital. But now this is going to change. We're going to have a northern and a southern kingdom. We have a civil war going on here, essentially. Israel stays northern, and then the southern kingdom is Judah. There could be some debate here, but Judah is going to look like the actual good one. This is based off Jerusalem. This is where some of the good kings are going to be found, and just nothing good happens in the north. The rest of 1 Kings is essentially told with looking at the northern versus the southern kingdom. I should say a lot of the middle part of this book goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and we look at like 40 total kings. Now, some of this is going to leak into 2 Kings, but I'm just grouping the numbers together for you. And in each of these, we get, were they good? Were they following God? Were they following the covenants? Did they allow false images and false worship of idols? Did they pray to other gods, etc.? So 2 more big pinpoints of what's happening during this book are the prophets and these other gods. We've talked about prophets quite a bit with Samuel and then with Nathan, but I found that I haven't explained very well the purpose of the prophet. The prophet speaks for God, like 100%, but he's also on the lookout all of the time to make sure that whatever ruler has been established is doing what they're supposed to do. And so it's this weird, intricate balance between sometimes God speaking directly to the ruler. This whole wisdom granted thing happened in a dream. No prophet needed. David was speaking directly with the Lord sometimes, and sometimes through Nathan. Usually it's when the prophet has to condemn something that the leader has done wrong. That's when he's going to come in. It's like that sin separates the leader from being able to hear from God, and the prophet has to come and say, uh-oh, you messed up. And oftentimes it is the prophet speaking for God who is saying, you are to lose your kingdom. This is going to happen. Choose your curse, yada, yada, yada. So again, such an interesting tension between these two. And we see that play out through the rest of the book as well. And then false gods. All of these intermarriages that Solomon was doing was bringing over new gods that he was allowing people to worship, and even worshiping himself and making idols for, etc. Like it's absolutely insane that this continues to happen. We have Solomon in one scene just professing how faithful God was to his father David and how innocent and young he is, and that's why he needs this wisdom. He wants to be in the same kind of favor where he's allowed to live like David was. A recognition of the true omnipotence and benevolence and only God aspect, then to just immediately fall down into making idols and marrying people that you're not supposed to marry for political alliances. And again, all with the wisdom of the wisest person that has ever existed in time and ever will, bestowed by the creator God himself. But I've gotten ahead of myself. I've definitely started dipping into 2 Kings. It's so hard to create that perfect line there. There's a couple last things that definitely happen in 1 Kings I want to address. And it all really mainly centers around the prophet Elijah, which is why I wanted to talk about exactly what a prophet is supposed to do. Elijah and his successor Elisha, which we'll see in 2 Kings, are probably like the two most powerful or best connected prophets with God, what they will do. And Elijah asked for a double dose. And so we see just a perfect remnant of this. You know, Elijah does 7 miracles, Elijah does 14. We see this just in many things where, again, I say that it looks really man-made. But Elijah comes on the scene, and he comes on the scene hard. He raises the son of a widow from the dead. But we'll skip some of that and we'll get to the big story that happens in this book, and that's Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets of Baal. It's an incredible story. So much happens. We're going to save it for point 7, so stick around through the end of this video where we can discuss it in the problematic passages. After this, we follow Ahab for mainly the rest of the book, and we get some really interesting things that happen with Ahab and other false prophets, this murder that Ahab commits in the vineyard, etc. We'll talk about all of it, but I think that's how we're going to wrap up the recap. Let's move straight on to point 2, which is authorship and date. So we're starting to get into some new territory. A lot of this point 2 has been kind of redundant in some of our other books, and this one will too, to a certain degree. Like most likely it was written during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century when it was compiled, but traditionally this gets attributed to Jeremiah, and it's really interesting, and I think there's a decent case to be made for this, but there's good scholarly reasons that this is not upheld. But Jeremiah's prophecies elsewhere really line up with the events that are described here in 1 Kings. Also, Jeremiah is all about idolatry and calling that out, which is another main theme here in 1 Kings. And so I can see the connection there. But what we really see when we apply some scholarly techniques is that there are multiple strands of authorship running through this. And it's a collection of things like oral history, written history, even court documents, as we look at so much of these lineages, not just lineages, but also political lineages with the succession of kings in both of the kingdoms after the split, etc. And we can tell by things like writing style, word choice, the utilization of certain Hebrew words, etc., that this came from a combination, if you will. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't a great redaction period that happened during its compilation, because we see some really elegant things happening here, which we'll talk about in point 4 when we get into literary technique. That can have the appearance of one cohesive author with an idea, but a better explanation is, again, that redaction period, that compilation period of fixing it, of putting it all together in a pleasing and symmetrical way. So right into point 3 with historical background, context, accuracy, etc. What can we say here? Nothing necessarily new from what we've had to say about other books, except with some detail swaps. Is there a broad aspect of truth that went from a single monarchy to a split kingdom because of geopolitical issues going on in the realm of Israel that is probably true to a certain extent, probably around this time frame? Yes. The fact of the matter is that before the Babylonian exile, we really don't have a lot of extra biblical archaeological confirmation of any of these things that are being told. We just have this accounting, mainly again via Jewish oral and some written traditions combined at this one period later on. We can still learn a lot about what tribes were doing in this day and how people and communities of the ancient Near East would switch from some kind of more egalitarian rule to something resembling something more of a monarchy monarchy, etc. This is par for the course with what we see. We also see some alliances here and some battles with some prominent figures such as Egypt, Tyre, the Assyrians. We know that all of those people were active and around at this time period, so that lends a little bit of confidence to some of the structure of 1 Kings. But the goal of these books needs to be considered, and the goal is theological purposes, much more so than historical accuracy. And there's just no way to validate the vast majority of what is said and claimed in books like this. And the bigger issue is that there will be contradictory claims in 2 Kings with 1 Kings, and also what's coming in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So we do have quite a bit of messy confusion and things that can't mutually exist at the same time. So moving right into point 4, literary technique, we see a few things on display, and it's really this balance between prose and poetry. Again, this is a historical narrative of the ancient Near East, and so we're seeing cause and effect, we're seeing lineage, we're seeing a time frame played out in succession, but within that we break it up with this prose versus poetry, with specifically the poetry highlighting certain things that are of more theological importance. This is going to be like Solomon's wisdom, the building of the temple, and other more religious examples that happen throughout the rest of the book, versus just this king took this kingdom, married this person from this land, created this alliance with this group, etc. So prose versus poetry. We also have a unique blend of symmetry and callbacks, the establishment of Jerusalem versus the division of it, the comparing of David to his son Solomon, the duality of the split of this chosen people group back into two nations, north and south. There's a lot of parallels being drawn here, a lot of recurring themes, a lot of interplay, really just an interesting book that, knowing it was made up of so many different sources and different kinds of sources and multiple original authors, being able to have a unity at the end that looks this clean is really impressive and really says a lot about the people of this time who were putting this together, which will lead us nicely into main themes. The abuse of power is something we've seen before, especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's highlighted nowhere better than it is here. Once again, you have someone like Solomon who is so ready to be blessed by God, who is blessed by God, who is given wisdom and who throws it all away, just like David did, just like Saul did, just like the judges did, just like Joshua did, just like Moses did, all the way back. Humans are too fallible in God's creation to ever have power and keep it correct. Every single time God says, hey, if you do this, if you follow my commands, I will protect you, I will keep you, I will give you a long life, I will make you prosperous, and I will use you and your descendants forever. And every single time they fail under that. Sometimes they fail because God himself is doing something, like when he torments Saul with evil spirits, but again, I digress. So the abuse or the misuse of power. This book is definitely the book that highlights the theme of the prophets, the role of them as a moral voice for the nation. Another big theme we see is the impact of foreign concepts, virtues, morals, gods, etc. We're getting more of a blend than we've had in the past, where it was one group traveling through the desert, one group leaving exile, one group conquering all the other groups. Now we've had this unification. David brought the 12 tribes together. There's only one place to go from this point of unity, and it's disunity. And that disunity spreads, and it's brought in by other cultures and other gods and other concepts, which will lead us to the next theme, which is going to be idolatry. Supposedly, the worship of other gods like Baal or Baal and that of Asherah lead to not only God's consequence, but just natural human consequence of less moral, less virtuous, which is hilarious to me because all those gods look better in all aspects of morality than Yahweh. And then it wouldn't be a book of the Bible if there wasn't a main theme about retribution, divine punishment, if you will. We see plenty of that. So let's take a quick look at point 6 and then get to the meat of today's video. Point 6 is always a hard one to talk about, reception and influence, because sometimes we have a ton of it and sometimes we see very little of it, and sometimes we see a blending. This one is going to be more of a blending. Is there a ton of inspiration that has come down in art and literature and the paintings and stained glass windows of events that happen in 1 Kings? For sure, specifically that of Elijah and having this prominent prophet now as part of the scene, but also so much of a trope of the abuse of power, of the fallen family, of the dynasty that crumples, etc., is not specific to Israel. It is a norm among what has happened to every single dynasty of any kind that has ever existed. We might pull on these particular stories more than, say, the Chinese pull on their stories because this is what has influenced the West. So when we think of kingdoms falling, of divine fallout, losing favor with your creator, we think of Israel screwing up. So it's similar, it's this blend, but to say that they were first or that it's the only is incorrect. And so I wouldn't want to give it too much credit. From a Jewish or Christian tradition, we see these stories as warnings. We see these stories about what happens when you let your political endeavors outweigh your spiritual endeavors. We see these as the need for not having a separation of church and state. When the prophets fall away, when they lose their voice over the monarchy, over the ruler goes wayward, enters into more sin, connects with other kinds of countries with lesser values and gets always pulled down, and then receives the consequences from God for that on top of that. If only they had been more tied together, this church and state concept. So in that regard, I think it's extremely dangerous and harmful for this kind of influence. But that would be the main quick summation of reception and influence. Let's move straight into point 7, contradictions, errors, misconceptions, problematic passages. So contradictions first. We have little things that could go either way. I'll give you an example. And a lot of this is book-to-book contradictions, not inner-book contradictions, like Rehoboam's age when he becomes king. In 1 Kings 14:21, we see that Rehoboam was 41 years old. Yet 2 Chronicles 12:13 tells us he was 18. Clear contradiction. Now, does it matter? Is it a salvation issue? Is it a copyist error? Sure, but once again, this book should be perfect. These things should add up. If the book is able to be flawed and have copyist errors, then who's to say that some of those errors aren't going to be more important for what we understand later, or the prophecies that are coming in some of these books that are shown and used to prove Jesus? How do we know those aren't errors or made up? I think, one, it obviously destroys the inerrancy of the Bible, but it can go past that, because a lot of people who say, yeah, we don't expect the Bible to be inerrant, then how do you know which parts are true? I've never understood that point. So there's loads of examples like that between Chronicles and Kings, or 1 Kings to 2 Kings, etc. We're not going to cover nearly all of them, like a vast number. We see issues with the length of the reign of all of these kings. Again, there's like over 40 kings mentioned, and these are retold often in 1 and 2 Chronicles, and none of that matches up. We have census and population issues when taken here versus taken in other books of the Bible for the exact same time frame. We have construction issues. This one is kind of interesting. In 1 Kings 7:23, you can go look up the circumference of the molten sea, this large basin. The circumference being like 30 cubits and the diameter being 10, which mathematically just doesn't align. A lot of people will point to this and say, see, the Bible doesn't even understand pi, and it's like 3 rounded versus 3.14. But again, with the context around the specifications that are given here, it seems they had a general understanding, but not a full understanding. So we could dive into that, and we probably will for its own point later on in a different episode where we look at some of these issues more in detail. Just a fun one, even though I've already kind of covered that this stuff exists en masse. In 1 Kings, we see Solomon's numbered wives and concubines listed at 700 wives and 300 concubines. What do you need 300 concubines for if you have 700 wives? But that's not the point. The point is, when you compare that with 2 Chronicles, we're told Solomon had 3,000 in total, not 1,000 in total. You could go years not ever needing the same wife. Nothing like God's beautiful creation of one man and one woman. Oh, wait, what? Can't wait to do the marriage episode where we talk about every iteration of marriage that God has not only allowed and condoned, but given as a gift. This is Solomon's gift from God, a blessing upon him. Explain that one to your wife when you want just a second wife, and see how godly and holy she thinks that idea is. So again, tons of contradictions, tons of errors. When you're dealing with a book like 1 Kings that isn't dealing with a lot of prophecy that leads to New Testament or salvation issues, it's easy to just dismiss as copyist errors, but it's setting a tone of incorrectness and disunity in this thing that is collected that is supposed to be the inspired word of God. Let's talk about the problematic passages, though. Let's get the old Bible out here, and let's start with just the story in general of what happens with Elijah versus Ahab and the prophets of Baal. I'm going to say Baal from here on out. I don't know if it's Baal or Baal, and I've said both. So the story mainly takes place in 1 Kings 18, and here's a quick synopsis. You have one prophet left for God, Elijah, and you have 450 prophets for Baal, this false god, under King Ahab's reign. And so Elijah just goes and says, let's have a contest. You have 450, I have one. Let's make 2 altars, put no wood on the altars. Let's both pray to our gods to send fire down to consume the burnt offering and see which god is real. Now there's so much to dissect here. And again, it just deserves its own episode. But a couple of the things that stand out to me are that these 450 prophets really believed that their God would show up and do this thing. They were cutting themselves as were their custom. They were really committing to the belief, which makes me believe they've seen their God move before in the same way that the Israelites had seen their God move. And again, a context that is left out of the Christian understanding here is that there were indeed other gods at this time, and they did other miraculous things. It was just a matter of which God was more powerful. And what we're really seeing here is Yahweh being more powerful than Baal. Not that Baal is a false god. That's the way it's been reinterpreted, as there being only this one God, but that was not the view at this time. It was all about, yes, of course there's other gods, but which God is the true God? Which God is the most powerful? So something to point out there. The other thing that really stands out from this story is the fact that God is okay with being tested. The very reasons during his prayer, and also Elijah here just really playing it up. He waits and waits. He lets them go first and he taunts them. Maybe your God is busy taking a shit. Like, this is the language that's used. It's a little watered down in the Bible, but if you look at the original Hebrew terms here, he is going off and mocking these people while they try so hard to get their God to show up. Then it's his turn and he says, let's make it harder. Pour some water on. Do it again. Do it a third time. And then in his prayer to God, he says, do this for why? So that these people will know you're the true God and will turn their hearts to you. So every single time that your pastor or your preacher has said, don't test God, God doesn't want to be tested, God shouldn't have to show up so that you'll believe in him. Wrong. This is exactly what the greatest prophet of God prayed for, and God showed up, sent the fire down, proving that he's okay with these tests, that he's willing to show himself in this manner to gain belief. It's why Jesus did miracles, by the way. We've only had to excuse this kind of behavior from the fact that it doesn't happen anymore because God's not real and we're not just making up stories. So we have to say, when God doesn't show up, when he doesn't answer prayer, when he doesn't heal the sick, when he won't reveal himself through his divine hiddenness by prayer, petition, and sacrifice, it is because God doesn't want to be tested. Who are we to question, etc.? No, God, according to the Bible, is fine with it. It's just not working, so you're making excuses for him. Call a spade a spade. So that's the setup. That's the story. I need you to understand it has its own issues there, but let's talk about a verse that makes it even worse. And this would be verse 40, which is nearing the end. This is after the 450 prophets failed, and Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Now, we don't get any examples of how this is done. It doesn't say God did it. Elijah, speaking for God, obviously had God's blessing to do so, but did he go and cut 450 throats in a row? And why? We just got 450 converts. They couldn't. God showed up so that they would know and turn their heart. 450 is a very small number compared to what God was doing to normal, good people, 70,000 that he killed to take his rage out on David's affair. And I understand these were people that were worshiping a false god and going against him, but still, this looks insane. If killing 450 men is the time where you don't blink an eye because of how much atrocity has happened, you know you're being desensitized to the evilness of this God. This is going to move us into just the next chapter, and it's so funny. Jezebel, after hearing about the 450 prophets, freaks out and says, by this time tomorrow, you will be like them, to Elijah, threatening to kill him. And he's afraid. It says he's afraid. This man that just tested God, that can get God to do anything at the whim of a quick prayer, is afraid of this queen, so much so that he runs away and begs God to take his life now so he doesn't have to deal with this because he's so afraid. And God puts him to sleep, has an angel gently touch him, bakes him a cake, literally, prepares him a jar of water, wakes him up to eat and drink, puts him back to sleep, gently touches him, bakes him another one, gets him more water, and does this to get his strength back up because this has been too great for him. You know, slaughtering 450 people by yourself really takes it out of you. Let the angel of the Lord cook for you to regain your strength so that you cannot be afraid of Jezebel, this mortal woman who has nothing on the God you serve. Isn't that just the whole thing you just tried to showcase? This Bible is ridiculous. I think going back to 1 Kings 3 is a problematic passage. God offering one individual anything they want is interfering with free will. I don't see any other way. Being a genie god and granting wishes, and the consequences of those wishes as we see them play out, were horrendous. The wisdom that God gave Solomon led Solomon to mass murder and enslavement. Is that God's wisdom? Or are we going to be told that that was Solomon acting in his own way against God? Well, isn't the way that God gave him the wisdom of the Lord? How, once you receive the wisdom of the Lord that is unparalleled with any man ever, can you do such mediocre, obviously immoral, bankrupt things that even God would have to punish him for? That looks more like a problem on God than a problem on Solomon. I don't know how other people just don't connect those dots. The writers who were writing this should have been like, wait a second, God just gave Solomon all of the best wisdom in the world, and then Solomon goes and does the stupidest things ever. No one else had a problem with that before they committed it to scripture. Okay. 1 Kings 14:9 is another one. Jeroboam has messed up and God threatens him and his entire household. Not just his household, his house as in his lineage, that he will sweep them away like one throws shit. Again, it is more accurate to say the word shit here than just dung like the Bible does, looking at the original Hebrew. It's harsh language. It's God being petty. It's God once again punishing other people for the sins of one individual, which he has previously said he will not do. So lots going on here in this verse. We have another free will issue at 1 Kings 12:15 where God interferes with Rehoboam's rejection of the counsel or the advice of those elders, which led to grave consequences. It seems like God is really meddling here in the affairs of people. There's a weird curse that's happening at 1 Kings 16:34 where Hiel of Bethel is rebuilding Jericho's walls and all his sons die, which is a curse that seemingly came from Joshua saying to never rebuild the city. Just interesting. Again, we have innocent children dying for the sins of their father. We also have everlasting curses way back from the time of Joshua. Fascinating stuff here. We have some more issues with divine punishment and what happens after Ahab has the wrongful acquisition of Naboth's vineyard. It's an interesting little story where Ahab himself kills and takes the vineyard from Naboth. It's used as this huge, like, look how bad King Ahab is, which seems like the most innocuous thing to happen in comparison to what like Saul, David, and Solomon were doing. But again, we have God's enemies and God's chosen ones. And this is what I mean about the inconsistency here. Like the way that this is described and the divine consequence where Jezebel's body will be eaten by dogs is very strange and different than when David is praised for being a man after God's own heart and yet goes and kills an innocent man like Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. Obviously, David gets consequences too. Well, he doesn't. Everyone around him does. But Ahab and Jezebel die for it. It's very interesting. 1 Kings 20:35, we see a prophet disguising himself to deliver a message for God, and it works. So God just allows this deception to happen, someone to speak for him incorrectly, and then punishes because of it. Problematic for many reasons. And we could go on, but I'll just end with one more. Let's do 1 Kings 22:19, and let me just read it to you because we haven't been doing much of that, and I do like to do that. And the Lord said, "Who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth?" And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, "I will entice him." And the Lord said to him, "By what means?" And he said, "I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." What the hell? God needs Ahab to be deceived. So he's like, hey, how are we going to do this? And one of the spirits says, I'll go and I'll put myself in all of these prophets and I'll lie to deceive so that we can concoct the situation we need for you to enact your judgment. And God says, yeah, good idea. Do that. And I'll make sure that it works. This is just insane. Tell me again about our free will. Tell me again about God following his own objective law that lying is always bad, deceitfulness is always bad. No, it's only bad when it doesn't serve his purposes, which makes it subjective. It makes it might makes right. How pathetic. How little of a God to need to concoct these things with his enemies so that he can enact his judgment in a way that satisfies him. This may seem lesser than the issues we covered for the problematic passages in, say, 2 Samuel or any of the other books, but if the whole Bible was perfect right up until this verse, this would be enough for me to be like, wait, what? No, I don't want to follow this God. This God is not just. This God is not fair. This God is not giving us free will and is allowing us our own accord to do what we need. It's absolutely sad. It is sad more than anything else. Yes, it's absurd and it's horrible and it's gross and all of the things that I like to say, but it's really sad that we believe this to be a good God, that a God would need to act this way, that a people would find this good enough to document and write down and do so in a way where we're supposed to see God as the good guy. God is the greatest villain here. So that's it for 1 Kings. A lot of 2 Kings handles some of these same issues. So 2 Kings will probably be a bit shorter next Thursday, but still a lot happens in this book that is highly fascinating, interesting, and really leads us down the chain of what's coming for the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, the Gentiles, and the need for Jesus and what happens in the New Testament. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day. I've got 2 videos coming for you this weekend, and I think Sunday's video is going to be a doubling down of last Sunday's video with another 20 commands that most Christians ignore and going over some of the replies that I got from the last video. Until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tier Iconoclast patrons, Shawn Skaggs and Jason Rollins, and my atheist advocate patron, Jarrod Nichols, for their incredible generosity. Also, a big shout out to my secular scholar patrons, of which we have some new ones. All other patrons are listed in the description of each video. Please consider joining this great group if you enjoy these videos or believe in my mission. Thanks, and have a great day.